Hello everybody. By the way, hi. How are you? I'm gonna remove this stream starts at 4 p.m. PST thing before I'm 10 minutes into the stream for the first time since I've started doing these.
Okay.
And also and also set this to the correct display. There we go. All right. So let me turn that on. Okay. So hello everybody. Today the whole thing is the one-on-one base. I mean, basically it's an encounter design lesson, right? Like that's basically what we're doing, D&D encounter design lesson. We're gonna have fun. We're here with Kybre.
Yep.
We're gonna
Hello.
have a good time. So you already have an idea of kind of what you want to do, right? So
Yep.
Why don't you walk us through that briefly?
Gotcha. So let me go back to what I typed up earlier. So I guess this lesson, what I want to focus on is more my encounter designs, because for the longest while I've had this long-standing issue where despite my players telling me that the gimmicks I put in fights are, fun, that ultimately it doesn't, or it's not super impactful for them in the way that I want it to be. And I guess what I want to focus on is, take some of my designs. How can I make encounters more meaningful to my players?
Sure. Okay. Well, the first thing I would say is let's unpack what that means a little bit, right? So can you give us like a little bit of an example of what you mean by the gimmicks are nice, okay? The players enjoy the gimmicks, but what do you wish would happen? Like what doesn't happen that you wish would happen, and or what doesn't happen, the opposite of whatever I just said is. Both of those.
Yeah. So basically, I'm aiming for, with some fights, I'm specifically aiming for it to be super like memorable. I think the key example is kind of the last big boss fight I ran, where due to, I guess, partially how the boss was designed, it's not this one, but partially due to how the boss was designed and the fact that I mistimed some of the narrative elements that it drew out, and essentially that tension tapered off before, in a way that made it so the fight was more frustrating, but at the same time very forgettable, because near the end, my players were repeating a lot of their turns, essentially.
Right. You got to the point where it was basically solved, and it was just a matter of like finishing the. Yeah. Okay. So would you have preferred if that combat had like more complexity to the point that they were, when they got to that point, they were solving a new problem? Or would you have preferred that solving that problem resulted in them essentially finishing the fight?
I guess in that case, probably solving the problem resulted in finishing the fight. And I guess that's kind of what I want to go into, is how to implement that into, I guess, the design of an enemy.
Got it.
Where...
Okay.
Yeah.
So why do you think that didn't happen in that encounter?
Well, in that encounter, I think using the combat curves framework that you made videos on previously, I think because I was using a narrative point as a second tension peak for that encounter, that I think part of it was me mistiming it and placing it way too early. And as a result, that tension tapering off a lot near the end. But also the fact that I also think balance was a huge issue, because that boss fight I set had way too much health, but it didn't do nearly enough damage because of how my players essentially solved the boss fight by just tactically maneuvering around areas it can attack.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, here's one really quick fix. Steal bloodied conditions from 4E. Done. The whole problem is solved. It's a really good safety net to have, actually, because then you can. I like to do things like so a lot of times when I do encounters, I'll give it like its whole stat block, and then I'll give it an additional ability that's basically like, in case of emergency, break glass kind of ability, right? Like it doesn't have this ability until I need it to have that ability, and then it does. and it works really well, because usually when you start sort of getting accustomed to the way encounter curves kind of play out compared to how you plan them, there's an old saying about, I can never remember the person who's I can never remember who. Damn it, this always happens. Swear to God, I turn this volume up every single time a little bit more. Whatever. Okay, so there's this what was I saying? When you're dealing with counter curves, there's this quote, this great quote from somebody who I can never remember the name of, never remember who to attribute this quote to, but it's something to the effect of like, planning is everything, but plans are worthless. And that's, I think, encounter curves encapsulate that concept really well, because you're really never gonna nail the curve in practice. Like, it's never really gonna play out. But if you want to make adjustments over the course of the combat, as the combat is running, you can do that. And I actually usually recommend that you do that, because in D&D, you just most of the time, yeah, you're right. Text is really small. We're not talking about anything on the screen yet. Don't worry, though. So most of the time, what happens is if you have like a group of designers or a designer or whatever doing something, you'll come up with the design, you'll come up with the hypothesis, and you'll test it a bunch, right? And you'll tweak. You don't get to do that in D&D, right? You can't do that. So I look at tweaking things on the fly basically as being the equivalent of playtesting and iterating, right? Because that's the only time you have to do that. Obviously, you have to be careful, because you can't change anything you've already done, of course. But you can do things like I give most of my creatures legendary actions, because they're great for managing curves, because you can have, right? Because otherwise what happens is you have, the only time tension usually rises is on the monster's turn. And if you only have one or two monsters, then what you get is, instead of like nice gradual curves, you get these weird spikes all over the place, where it's like, it's only when they're like attacking or whatever. So, those are all really good considerations, and the way I think that factors into combat curves is, when you're doing the curve, what you want to do is you want to say things like, I think that this set of mechanics is going to create this part of the curve, right? As I'm sure you did when you did a combat curve. But what you've done is you've created an excellent hypothesis, right? This is like it's an excellent design statement, and the thing that makes it an excellent design statement is that it can be proven correct or incorrect. But it might be proven incorrect because you haven't tested it yet. So you want to be aware that, like, if this turns out to be wrong, I need a backup plan. And that is super important in D&D, because you don't get to iterate, you don't get to play tests. You just kind of have to go with your initial. And of course, over time, you kind of get better at it, but it never gets all the way there. And you sort of start to figure out how to anticipate the kinds of problems you're going to run into, especially as you... also, out of curiosity, did you use one of the curves that I use as an example, or did you define your own curve?
I think I loosely based it off of like the big boss fight curve, but I think tweaked it a little bit to. I intended to draw it out a bit more than what you had on the video, but again, probably that narrative peak was mistimed.
Okay. Okay, so I think that helps get a pretty good idea of like what kinds of issues you are sort of running into, and also. I'm thinking that the thing that I just laid out is probably going to be a foundation for what we're doing moving forward, hopefully. Otherwise, I just wasted a bunch of time. But it probably will be. So
Yeah.
let's kind of put all that aside and then look at this, right? This encounter that you're currently designing.
Yep.
Do you have a curve for this encounter?
Nothing specific, but
Okay.
probably what I'm thinking is kind of a single peak kind of mid boss curve for this. So probably
Okay.
probably it'll start out near the bottom, and then it'll rise to the peak once, but never really fully taper off. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
But then the peak will never really fully taper off, and there will still be this lingering tension kind of after the fight's over.
So you want this to set up something else, like, because when you don't resolve the fight, usually that is an indication that you're setting something up.
Yep, essentially setting up a quest line.
Got it. Okay. So, and it's basically the mini boss you said. Now recently learned that I cannot capture my screen tablet, which is great because then I can do whiteboard stuff because it's plugged into my motherboard and not my graphics card. And I didn't fix that. So I'm going to make a little graphic and then put it over here. It'll just take a second. But basically what I want to lay out is sort of what I think a good curve for what you've got highlighted here. Unbroken bonds work as the core, like allowing the twins to come and go and sort of trade off. So I want to play with that a little bit. Why is this in grayscale? Mode. You can be RGB. That's fine. And I'm just going to really quickly do a sort of the kind of curve that we're looking for.
Gotcha.
And I'm going to basically completely deviate from the idea of the mini-boss curve because I want to make a bit of an argument.
Gotcha.
Let me just... that works. Be really nice and there. So this is the curve that I'm kind of proposing, or at least as a starting point. So you think about it, because I don't remember which one it might have been. I had one of the videos that talks about layering different kinds of curves. And I think this might be an appropriate circumstance to apply that technique, because what you can do is you can say, hey, what if this enemy, where each line indicates or represents one of the two twins, right? And you have one spikes while the other dips. And that is definitely going to be a huge asset in creating this sort of trade-off feel, right? It's definitely going to feel like they're kind of popping in and out because of they are, right?
Yeah, quite literally.
So I think that's based entirely off of this goal specifically. I should probably not do that over there. Yeah, so that's based entirely off of that goal. And what that does is it helps us start to identify and clarify how we're going to design this encounter, right? Notice that I'm basically ignoring all of this right now. I want to establish a part of building a vision is difficult. It's one of the hardest things to do in design is building a really good, clear vision. But once you kind of start to nail it, what you'll figure out is that a big part of creating the vision is about setting up your own criteria for assessment. And that those criteria should be really, really, really clear. So one of the really useful things, one of the things I like about combat curves is that they help us to define those criteria. So, for example, if we start building mechanics now, just hypothetically, let's say we decided, yes, we're gonna totally commit to this curve. Then if we started going down here, we could start comparing the actual mechanics of the fight and asking, well, you know, if blue is Lon and red is Lin, then do the mechanics of Lin support starting low and then ramping up, and do the mechanics of Lon support starting high and then tapering and then ramping and tapering. And of course, this is going to get truncated because you don't want it to resolve. And the way I usually do that is I would probably, you just decide the most appropriate time to truncate, because obviously if you truncate it kind of like right near the end where one is really low and one is really high, we can probably start to anticipate what the experience of that might be, just hypothetically, versus if we truncate it here versus if we truncate it here, etc. But the curve is sort of one of the big, really useful ways to utilize curves, is to sort of bridge the gap between, well, here's our sort of narrative goal. We want it to feel kind of like this. And going, well, if this is sort of the way we want it to play out narratively, what does that look like as a curve, as an intensity curve? Well, this creature is more intense than this creature at this different points. And I'm not saying we have to commit to this curve, because we might alter this to the point where, like, actually we want 2 spikes from Lon and 1 spike from Lin, right? Whatever. We can come up with a lot of different arguments for that, but that's going to be part of the refinement process. So if we take that concept, how do you feel? Well, first of all, let's go all the way out. How do you feel about combining that curve with this concept versus defining this concept using the mini boss curve that you were originally going to use?
I think the positive in that, or I guess I'll just break it down to, like, positive, negative. I think the main positive is that having 2 separate curves allows me to, I guess, focus more on this Lin and Len as kind of 2 separate entities. However, the single curve helps me manage, I guess, the overall experience better, but probably we can probably do some layering on top of that.
Oh, sure. I mean, we can actually, counterintuitively, if we increase the complexity of the curve, we might actually make it simpler, where we kind of do the same thing, but a little bit different. I'm just going to make another curve. Oops. There we go. And then you kind of end up with one of these. Fix that. I'll just slap this in here. Formatting be damned. There. I mean, this is obviously extremely rough, but
extremely rough. Yeah, you
can see how, like, now they function on different curves. That's going to make one feel. That's also going to help make them feel like distinct creatures, but they also kind of together average out to creating kind of a mini boss curve.
Yeah, I think that probably works better in terms of the overall vision I'm trying to accomplish with this fight.
Great. Okay, so this is a really good first step then, because we went like, I took what you were saying and I tried to represent it via a curve, and you were able to be like, yes, but also no. And we can take, because there were specific reasons, because there was like a specific set of, here's the parts that don't line up, we're able to iterate on that in a very concerted way, very quickly and easily, right? Because we can say, oh, we can solve that problem, right? No problem. You because you outlined such a clear problem, we can just deal with it, no issue. And if you're still not entirely satisfied with this, we could go even farther. We could do another iteration, no problem. But the important thing is that you feel like, yes, this curve is an accurate representation of the vision for the fight, because the curve is also another way in which this is a valuable tool is just using it as a tool to more concretely communicate the vision. It's just a tool for working through the vision and communicating it clearly. General rule of thumb is if you can't communicate your vision clearly, your vision isn't clear enough. But also, going through the process of attempting to communicate it more clearly will clarify the vision for you. So having a tool to do that is really nice. So how do you feel about this curve? Positive, negatives, again.
I guess I guess the positive is that it really matches the vision. The negative is that the complexity, I'm not sure how well that's going to translate mechanically when we start outlining abilities for the twins.
Well, that's true. But here's the benefit. Here's the benefit. Oh, I didn't do these on different layers. Oops. Bad. Now I have to awkwardly erase stuff. That's no problem, because now we just delete everything except... How do you feel about designing for that curve? Probably simpler.
Yeah.
Well, that's fine. We just design for two different curves. No problem. If you just sort of isolate them and then design for them individually and then layer them and go, okay, now do these work together, it is a complex design problem, but I think the strength of the process is that it will result in a much simpler combat from the player's perspective, because we're going to create mechanics only to the extent that we need them to accomplish these curves. So there's not going to be like, you're not going to end up in a situation where you have 9 mechanics that accomplish one thing. And then as you work on the design, you can start to get better and better and better ideas of like, what, if I give this creature this ability, this one ability, that will change based on the circumstance. And it's one ability, but the scenario that surrounds it is going to change over time. Or maybe you even have an ability where, like here's an idea. If this represents one of your creatures, have another, have the other one do something like, layer the floor in acid, right? And it's not a lot of damage. It's just acid. It's just there. But then the other one pops out like for the second time, and then uses its fire ability, the same fire ability that it used the first time it was around. But this time it ignites the acid, it evaporates it or something, and it becomes acidic gas. Maybe it's poison instead of acid, something like that, right? Where the ability sort of layers on top of one another. That way you have one ability that's creating different peaks at different times. So you create a very simple design that, that was a very rough example, but you're creating... The point is that you can potentially create one mechanic that potentially results in multiple different kinds of curves where it's the same mechanic, but it feels very different on each iteration. And then you as a designer, there's a complex challenge for you because you have to identify how this mechanic works in the various circumstances, and how they sort of synergize. That way, that also connects the creatures more, so that it feels more like a team of things trying to attack you, and it's going to be more likely to result in that sort of mini boss curve. So you're right, it's a complex curve, but that's okay. As the designer, you can deal with complexity. You can deal with complexity. If it's going to result in less complexity for your players, that's a good thing, right? You can adopt, almost like adopting the burden of complexity for yourself, so that your players don't have to deal with it, if that makes sense. So, how do you feel about designing these creatures now?
I guess separating them. Is kind of probably. I guess this approach is probably a good way to go about it, though that probably if you look at the stat block below, that differs greatly from what my original approach is. But if we're redesigning it to make it better, all for it.
Yeah, well, that's okay, right? Because then what we can do is there are, I think, two options here. One, we can throw out the old vision, to throw out the old stuff, because we still, importantly, we're still working from the exact same core vision, right? We haven't changed that. So one option would be to like say, let's sort of look through this and see if any of this stuff fits with the new process, and keep that, and then throw the rest out. The other option, another good approach here, would be to just put this all to the side and design the creatures from scratch, and then look back and compare and go, well, you know, if we have specific ideas for why Gemini Trick, for example, exists, and that's going to create a very specific kind of experience in a very specific circumstance, because Gemini Trick is a design solution to some problem that we have. Great. What I'm concerned by is in any design, the biggest concern I always have with any design is a design that is just there. I always like to say a design should be a very specific solution to a very specific problem. And that's because I think people have a tendency to want to design, and then they kind of get the vision process out of the way, and it's sort of mostly perfunctory, and they get that out of the way so that they can do the design stuff, and they just get to make up mechanics. But they're not solving problems with those mechanics. And it's really important, in my view, to go through this very rigid process of going, here is the process. The reason we want to have a really good process is because we need a very clear set of constraints and criteria for assessing our own designs. Those are two of the most important functions of an initial vision. This is a pretty good starting point. We have this idea of like the core of the design is all about having like this feeling of like back and forth, like a tag team kind of thing. And then we figured out kind of at least a decent way of expressing that in a curve. And the reason we want to figure out a decent way of expressing that in a curve is because it's expressing this in mechanics is almost impossible, because there's nothing that translates between those two languages. So we've now got a translation. We've built the bridge between them, because we can build mechanics for this and we can build a curve for this. So now when we start building mechanics, it'll be much more concerted. And if we find, when we start building a new set of creatures, if we find that we're creating very concerted mechanics in order to achieve this curve, which is not arbitrary, right? We didn't just go this curve and then that was it. We talked through why this curve, why you feel, in your opinion, the designer's opinion, why you feel that this curve does in fact accurately represent your vision. And if it doesn't, we need to iterate, right? We need to fix that. But once we've gotten past that point, then we can say, all right, now when we design mechanics, we have a very clear set of constraints for whether or not we think those mechanics are going to work. We're going to be able to build arguments that are objective, that are either correct or incorrect. And again, we don't know which one of those it is until we test it, but we will know immediately when we test it because of the way we've framed the problem, or framed the solution, the question. So we're going to design mechanics for the curve, and then we're going to compare, we don't have to, but we could compare the curves that we use to design, or the mechanics that we design to hit this curve with these mechanics. So, for example, I'm hopefully about to illustrate this point very effectively. Going back to, let's say, shilling schizophrenia. I'm just picking an ability at random. What is the purpose of this mechanic? Like, why did you add this mechanic, and why did you make it do the damage that it does? Why does it have the range that it has, etc.?
Well, essentially, kind of chilling schizophrenia is kind of a pair ability with burning schizophrenia on Lin, where they kind of bounce off of each other to do kind of incremental damage and also leave marks on, well, the players. So essentially, it's this balancing game between, and this is also taking into consideration the invisibility mechanic that is within this original design, that you need to kind of space out space out carefully around these characters and essentially try to, I guess, how do I phrase it? Essentially try to play around their ranges and what marks you as a player have on you to avoid getting hit by, well, big damage, because on its own it doesn't deal a lot of damage, but when you have marks on you, for example, here, if you have marked with Curse of Flame, which is from Burning Schizophrenia, you take an extra damage.
Right.
You take extra damage, fire damage, because of the mark.
So we have a mechanic where one of them hits you, the other one hits you after you've been marked, and you take extra damage. And this is meant to incentivize the players to do what?
Essentially, it's kind of to incentivize the player to minimize, I guess, how much they're getting hit. Oh, actually, the marking is actually up here, and this is where the marks get procced for extra damage. I should clarify. But in essence, it's basically functionally it's so that the player keeps track of where the to kind of force the player to keep track of where the invisible twin is. Because with this current design, only one is visible at a time, and as soon as one attacks, the other one turns invisible.
Okay. So how does this work with the curve, do you think?
In essence, because of the stacking damage, it's gonna work probably closer to probably the highest peak, where I'm hoping that the players haven't fully solved and created a strategy for this fight, but they're taking kind of this big damage with also a potential condition attached to it, and mainly serve as kind of, a big scare that, because initially they won't be doing a lot of damage, that, this damage is going to build up, and that, if they don't find some sort of solution to deal with the flip-flopping invisibility, that it's going to end up problematic. That's probably not super clear, but yeah.
It's well, let me ask a probably a better question. At this second peak, the middle peak, the high one, what do you want to be going through your players' heads? Like, what thought do you want them to have?
More so, I guess when this maxes out, more the, oh crap, this really hurts. Oh crap, this really hurts. I need to keep track of the other one. Kind of deal. And this goes both ways for both like schizophrenia moves.
Okay. From the sound of things, this is going to be a longer fight, which I think you mentioned already, but well, I mean, so like, for example, I don't know exactly how long, but this little spike here is probably not going to be one round. It's probably a couple rounds. We may have to adjust this red curve, right? We may have to adjust it so that we have like almost like a tutorial for the fight, like a couple rounds there. And you might want to shift what you just described to that section of the curve, because then what you have is, okay, now the players kind of understand the premise of the fight, right? Then you need to design things that make it so that they have to deal with the premise, where we're understanding the premise. And this is the difference between, I mean, not in terms of technical definitions, but this is the difference between something that you would call maybe like a really effective combat design versus merely a gimmick. A gimmick would be something where once the players figure it out, they're pretty much good to go. They pretty much are done. Whereas a more solid design. And I think I think we're starting to get a sense of what you meant by making the designs more meaningful now, where you want it to be less about the players going, oh, I figured out kind of the how this functions, and now we just deal with it. And you want it to be more about, we figured out how this functions, and that's step one. That allows us to deal with this, but here are all the new challenges that arise as a result of dealing with it in that context. So what we need to do then is define, I think, how this curve accomplishes that. Because now we've got, like, here, let me do a different text so that we know which is mine. Also, define the experience through what meaningful design means. And I'm just making that note to reference what you've already brought up, where you want it to be meaningful versus a gimmick. And that being the definition of, like, players have issues dealing with the combat scenario beyond simply figuring out the premise. Something like that. You could actually go much more in depth with that. Like, you could definitely sit here and define that further. This is one of those situations where you don't want to fall into the trap of, let's spend all of our time defining what we mean by meaningful, because at some point we want to move on. And it's also worth noting that and I know I'm, like, going on a lot of little tangents, but I want to point out why we're doing things in terms of the process and what value of doing that at that point in the process is. And in this case, I would say we have, like, we started with, I want the design to be more meaningful, right? And that kind of means something. We're going to need to define that more, but we didn't need to immediately. And then as we started going through this other stuff, we started to uncover things like, oh, so really what you want is you want this to unfold. And when you said meaningful, you meant something more like this. And this isn't a complete definition yet, but you can come back and update it as you gain a more clear understanding of what you meant by meaningful. And we have it's better now. We don't have to stress about it and go, let's spend an hour defining meaningful. It's just, let's keep that in mind, because that's definitely part of your design goals, right? We just, basically what we just did was we made a tacit question an explicit question. This is actually definitely part of your vision for the fight. This is part of what you're trying to accomplish. And it's really good to have that written out, because now you basically have two sets of criteria right now. You have oops, don't move it. You have this and you have this. And then we have a curve which may need to be updated now based on this, because the curve was based on only this. So you see how we're kind of going through and iterating across all of the dimensions, but because we have tools like the combat curves, and because we have tools like making sure that we're being very clear about our tacit questions and very clear about what our goals actually are, because sometimes we have goals beyond what we realize our goals are. Not only can we now design for this, we can also question whether or not it's a goal that we want to have, because it was definitely a goal that you had. But now that it's written out explicitly, is it still a goal that you have?
I would say so, because I would still say so, that, you know, this is a goal that I still have, because, well, sure. Even if it's not kind of, I guess, as you said, you know, I guess part of it is also, I'm not sure what meaningful means as well.
Yeah, well, we're getting there, right? We're slowly defining it over the process of design. Because meaningful is going to mean a little bit of a different thing with every design. But part of the process is defining what we mean by meaningful. Over time, hopefully what you'll do over time is build a habit where meaningful just isn't the statement that you use initially. You start in a more clear place. But we can get there from meaningful by working through this other stuff and going, hey, seems to be kind of what you meant. and we're on the process of defining that further, which is good. It's good to have that, and there was no right or wrong answer to is this still a goal. The important thing in terms of process is just the ability to say consciously, to make the conscious decision of yes, that's part of my goal. Just it's not a huge, like, it's not absolutely correct or incorrect to have that as a goal or not. But it is objectively better to have a conscious understanding that that's part of your goal, as opposed to leaving it as this abstract thing that is a tacit abstract goal, because then you can't design for something that you don't really consciously understand, or at least you can't purposefully design for something you don't consciously understand.
Yep.
So it's good. Perfectly valid goal to have, and it's red, so we can always do something like we know we want the players to be dealing with this in some significant way. So let's go back to this schizophrenia mechanic, or the chilling burning schizophrenia mechanic. Do you think this will accomplish this goal? Or it doesn't have to accomplish it by itself. But the first question is, do you think it'll accomplish this goal by itself? And the second question is, if so, why? And if not, then does it serve a function in a larger system that does solve that?
I think going back to those questions, not on its own, I think it definitely requires I think because what it is a big damage plus a potential condition, that it by itself isn't going to go for like the goal in terms of like it's not going to accomplish the entire goal on its own. But I think when paired with kind of that paired invisibility mechanic of when one attacks, the other one turns invisible, it's getting closer, although I don't think it's fully there.
Okay, what's it missing?
Well, I think it's missing. I guess I think it's missing what's after that, because even with, I guess, the ridiculous range and 2-hit it has, after the players understand that flip-flop mechanic and how it works, then and start to play around that, then the impact the schizophrenia move has suddenly falls off a cliff. Essentially, I think it's there. I just think it needs more so that it's an obstacle beyond the premise, I think.
So basically you have the creatures of the thing, then the PCs react in a way, and then there's no follow-up to that because all you have is the PCs react in a way. So how do you and then you get into this sticky situation that D&D design frequently is in, which is the idea of well, I don't know what the PCs are going to do. And this is where the distinction between player agency and the illusion of player agency becomes very important, because there are certain elements of the design where it's much better for the overall experience of the encounter if there's a point in the fight where the players don't have a lot of options. And then the question becomes, what do we want the players to do? Like, how specifically do we want the players to handle that? Well, not just this mechanic, but that interaction that you just described. And can we make it so that the players feel like they made that decision on their own, even though the design is basically driving it itself? But first, the question is, how do we want the players to react? Broadly, it doesn't have to be like turn for turn specific. It's just like, do we want them, should they be looking for the thing that goes invisible? Should they be shifting their focus to the thing that becomes visible? Should they be worried about positioning? That's another thing that they might.
I guess there's kind of a few layers to this. What I'm expecting out of when they first find out the stacking mark effect, it dealing extra damage, what I kind of expect them then to do is, first of all, couple things. Depends on the player and their build. Just going off the top of my head and knowing my party, I would expect the backliners to start kind of trying to figure out where the invisible twin is and kind of moving away from the ranges to not get blown up. And I would expect the frontliners to also try and figure out where the invisible twin is, but with I guess kind of a different purpose of like, because there is a monk in my party. Actually, no, not anymore. Right. Right. He swapped off characters. So, not monk anymore, but also I kind of expect the frontliners to, I guess, kind of charge in and
It sounds like you're not going to hear me say this very often, but you're getting too specific.
Yeah.
I'm going to make a little comment here, because what we're doing is we're trying to define a decision point. We're trying to define one very clear decision point that is kind of the hinge of the fight. Now, this might be incorrect, but it sounds like what you're trying to do is create a decision point where the players have to make a core decision about whether or not they look for the invisible thing and try to deal with that, or try to hit the thing that's currently visible. Basically. Would you say that's the most important thing that you want them to worry about in that moment?
Yeah. I guess that's probably the most important thing.
Okay. Why? What are the pros and cons of going after the invisible one versus the pros and cons of going after the one that's currently visible?
Well, I guess the pro of going after the one that's currently visible is, well, you can see them, so you don't have to expend extra resources into kind of doing more damage. And also, the pro to I guess attacking going after the invisible one is getting a better picture of where the other one's going and how they're controlling the space that is the battlefield. Because if you can't see them, you don't know what they're going to try to do.
Okay. What are the cons of going after the one that's currently visible?
Well, the con is that you're not going to know when the invisible one, or like you're not going to know where she's going to show up or who she's going to target, because you don't know how they're moving. Here
we've created a core tension, right? Efficiency now versus, what would you call it? Ability to anticipate. Core tension. That's so if this is the most important general, like, sort of category of decision, like the most important single pivotal decision point that you want your players to make, and this is defined in terms of player goals as this, because you can see, does that make sense, by the way, how you would go from this, and then by looking at it through a lens of player goals, how you get to this is the decision they're actually making? So that's how you generate a core tension in a design, is you have this decision point and you go, well, what is significant about about those two decisions, right? You have A or B. what is significant about making that decision. And you've created this core tension of, well, really the fight is about being efficient now. Really the whole fight is about being efficient now versus being less efficient in the course of a round in the hopes of gaining more information that makes you more efficient over time.
Mm-hmm.
That's really what this fight is all about. That's what I'm hearing. Is that accurate?
Yeah, for the most part. I think in terms of wording, that's the best way I could probably word it myself. So yeah.
Awesome. So what we've got, so now we can go all the way back, right? And we have yet another goal. Players must make determinations about whether to be more efficient in the current, on their current turns, or attempt to gain information in the hopes of being more efficient over the course of the entire fight. Right? This is our core tension.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a couple things to note. One is that the core tension is not the only design goal. It's one of them, right? Now we have 3 design goals. That's a good number of design goals to have. If you're generally trying to put together design goals, a good rule of thumb is 3 is a good, generally a good number to have. There's no magic number, but usually if you have 3, you're probably in the right. If you've defined them well, it's probably about the right number. So now we could go back and go, well, does this curve still work, right? Another one of the possible approaches would be to look at this in terms of combat curves and go, can I define this in terms of a combat curve? And maybe we delete these curves completely, right? Because if we do a curve now, we're working for more information. We have a better understanding of what the goals of the fight are. And this idea of defining the experience more meaningfully, we just did that. That's done. So yes, this is one of your design goals, generally. How are we going to do that? Well, we're going to make it so that the entire fight revolves around this core tension. All of it. Now, you might find things like, I don't know, maybe invisibility is insufficient, right? Maybe they need to phase through the wall or something and go like a ghost. Maybe they need to do something else. Maybe invisibility is sufficient. I don't know. But we can start looking at, the point is we can start looking at individual mechanics and going, well, does the whole system work toward this goal? Does it, because now every single thing in the design of this encounter has to drive this core tension. All of it. This is the nucleus of the cell of your design, right? Everything it's the center of the world. Everything revolves around it. And that's gonna help guide a lot, because now if I ask, hey, how does the schizophrenia mechanic help drive your gameplay goals? The question has become much more concrete, much more clear. Now we're asking, hey, does this mechanic contribute to this core tension? And if so, how?
Gotcha.
That's a difficult question to answer, but a big part of the challenge of design is answering those kinds of difficult questions, and the other big challenge is generating questions that, when answered, will generate answers that result in a really meaningful design, a concerted design in this case, like a design that solves, going back to the phrase, every design should be a specific solution to a specific problem. Well, right now, let's say we deleted, right? Let's say there was no monsters designed yet. There were no mechanics yet. Then the first problem is if this is our core tension and we have no designs, we have no monster designs, then the problem is that we're not achieving our core tension because nothing happens. So the first thing we need to do is make something happen. It's the first problem. So why do we design anything in the first place? Well, because if we don't create our core tension, right? So even just justifying the beginning of designing a creature is a specific solution to a specific problem. Now, it's unrealistic. It's utterly unrealistic for anyone to be able to sit with a blank document and go immediately to this and this.
Mm-hmm.
Right? What we went through was a slightly slower process, but a very standard process for all human beings. You don't start here. We did some stuff. We played around with some combat curves. We played around with justifying some of the mechanics based on a general sense of kind of what we hope we'll accomplish. We tried to justify these systems before we had this core tension. We tried to justify those systems using only these two goals, and found out that those aren't actually the only goals. We found out that in fact there's this core tension that we're trying to drive. That's really what this is all about. And it's through going through that process that we kind of discovered that and generated this very clear goal. But now that we have this, we can start breaking the design down, because now we can say, well, players have to make determinations about whether to be more efficient in their current turns, right? So okay, this is going to be a really obvious note, but worth having, and certainly illustrates why having clear goals is so useful. Need mechanics that make current turns efficient.
Mm-hmm.
Need information the players can gain that potentially, that they anticipate will make the overall combat more efficient at the cost of current turn efficiency. Now we have these. These are things that you might call, I mean, not these exactly, but we're starting to push toward things that you might be able to define as gameplay pillars. If you've ever heard the term gameplay pillar, this would be one of your pillars. The information that the players gain has to be information. When the players gain information, they need to be anticipating that it's going to make them more efficient, but also be at the cost of current turn efficiency. And when you say that, it's like, if someone just said that and we hadn't done all this groundwork, then it would just be like, oh, that's just that's just a thing you just decided, right? You just said it. Like, you just said that needs to happen. It's not grounded in anything. But because we've got this core tension decided, because we've identified and defined that core tension, this no longer feels arbitrary. In fact, it feels hilariously obvious, to the point that it seems silly to even type it out as a separate thing.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, clearly this is one of our design goals. It can't not be.
Right, yeah.
So this is kind of how you slowly go through the process of defining design goals, and this is the hardest part of design. Building a vision is the hardest part. It's really unfortunate, because in order to be making really good concerted design decisions, you have to have a really clear vision, where the vision creates, again, going all the way back to the beginning, the vision has to generate criteria for assessment. So if you create a mechanic, you can now ask yourself, does that mechanic accomplish either this or this? If not, you probably don't need it.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you say, yes, my mechanic in fact accomplishes this, and it can accomplish both, right? You can say, well, not anyone in particular, but I managed to design a mechanic that kind of does both at once. And great, that's even better, right? More efficient. But then if you design a mechanic and you say, yeah, actually this mechanic is accomplishing this pillar. This mechanic is there so that it drives this pillar. Then I can say, okay, how does it drive that pillar? And you'll have an answer for that, right? It won't just be like, oh, because I assume, right? There will be no stuttering or stammering. There's no abstraction. It's, well, because the players are doing this thing, this part will make them anticipate. This is the information that they're going to get, and this is what they probably expect to achieve out of that. And then we would apply actionable iteration to that mechanic. The principle of actionable iteration, so that we're talking about, like, when the player is anticipating something, how does that work out? And because we want the player to anticipate things, actionable iteration has to be applied, because if we don't, then the players are going to very quickly learn that the thing that they anticipate doesn't happen, and then they're going to stop anticipating.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So we need actionable iteration to be part of that. And this is where we start to bring in all of these other little frameworks that are like, okay, here's where that would apply, and why it's not just a nice to have, but why it's absolutely crucial that we follow that principle. Because if we don't, there's no anticipation. And if there's no anticipation, then the players don't have anything to compare against in terms of current turn efficiency, and players are just going to go back to being efficient turn to turn, because that's generally how D&D 5th edition combat tactics are best played as a general rule. I mean, not always, but as a general rule. And you're working against that. You need to shift the tension from what's kind of traditional in 5th edition combat to something different. And is it starting to make sense, like how we're gonna make this combat, well, how you're gonna make this combat feel pretty unique and feel significant?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's starting to come together a little bit now that the goals are more defined.
Yeah, and you can go back and rework these are garbage, whatever. You don't need those. You can make new curves, and if you make a new curve, you can ask yourself, how does this tension look in a curve? Mm-hmm. Because remember, with curves, the vertical axis is just intensity. It's pretty vague. Intensity is pretty vague. So we started abstract with just saying in general intensity. But now that we have this core tension, we can start saying, in the context of this combat encounter, what is intensity? Mm. Mm-hmm. I'm going to make a note.
Yep.
What is intensity in the context of this combat encounter, given the core tension? And also, this statement right here, oh my god, if you read that statement out of the context, out of context of all of the things we've just talked about, that sounds like nonsense. It's just, that sounds like a sentence that just doesn't mean anything. Mm-hmm. But it does mean something, right? Because we have a really clear core tension. So when does intensity rise? In a way that drives this core tension. Is it when they realize, and this is going to be this will be a process of further defining the core tension, because what we're doing is we're saying go away, there we go. What we're doing is we're defining basically something like, is intensity at its highest point when players are really torn between these two options, or is an intensity at its highest point when they choose an option, but then they get the feedback very quickly, hopefully, that was definitely the wrong choice in that scenario? And that's when actionable iteration comes in, where you have to also define, like, if that's the case, you need to also define what could the players have done, and what feedback can you give them to make them realize that they could have done that even with the information they had at the time, if that makes sense. And those are two very different ways of defining intensity. And if you define intensity in one way versus the other way, you're going to create a very different combat, right? If you define intensity by it's when the stakes, well, if the stakes are high, intensity will always go up pretty much no matter how you define it. But if it's a matter of, like, they don't know which of these to do, then what we need to be doing is what the designs need to do is they need to drive the players toward having to make that decision in situations where making that decision is difficult, where there are just a few very incomparable things, and then you raise the stakes so that those two things together define a kind of intensity that is unique to that combat encounter. Mm-hmm. Design is hard. It's just hard.
Yeah. Gotcha.
But it helps a lot if you just take it really slow, step by step, and don't worry too much. Like, don't worry too much about things like when you get to this point, right, it would have been a mistake in terms of process to get to this point and go, okay, I don't really know what that means. I don't know. I still don't really know what meaningful design means in this context, and this isn't that clear of a design goal. That would be a really correct statement, that would be a very insightful thing to see and say about that statement. But it would probably be a mistake in terms of your process to go, okay, I'm going to define that first, because we need context. We need the things to kind of come together. And even if, and I'm not saying that you did this, but even if every single mechanic in these creatures was designed completely arbitrarily, we can still use them as a sort of anchor point to go, can we justify this given these goals? And then you keep the parts that you can, and you tweak the parts that you can't until you have as few systems and mechanics as you possibly need in order to accomplish this tension over the course of your combat. Mm-hmm. And at all points, you need to be driving this tension. And your design needs to be justifying how you're driving that tension at each point. And the way to do that is combat curves are a good tool for that, because combat curves define kind of like keyframes, basically. And you need to define how those decision points play out, because you could, for example, do this. You could, if you wanted, define maybe 3-ish decision points along a curve, where each decision point is a different expression of the core tension. So I'm going to quick example. Players understand that inefficiency on, I'm just going to make up a turn. Let's just say turn 3, round 3. May result in, I don't know, saving throw against bad thing. It doesn't even matter what that thing is. But efficiency over the next 2 to 3 rounds is in question because of crucial information that they currently lack. This creates a sense of, do we attack, do we try to maximize efficiency now, or find a way to get crucial information that we lack, the same information? And that's useful, because if they choose the latter, mm-hmm. you can go, well, here's what that information would be, and here's how you would get it, and there's this interesting way of getting it, right? And then that breaks down into its own like sub challenge or two, and now 2 or so rounds of combat are built around that challenge, getting that information. Like, how do they get the information? They know what the information they need to get is, but they don't know how to get it. So the challenge comes down to, how do they get the information, right? And this would be like example of a decision point that flows from the core tension. Again, that's one of those statements that out of context sounds like nonsense, but isn't. Okay, that was a lot. That was kind of a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We've got a lot of notes on there.
Mm-hmm.
Oops. And I know we didn't like touch any of your designs, but I feel like, I don't really want to do that, because it's like, well, what would be the point of that, right? Because I could just be like, well, let me just change this.
Yeah.
It's better if we work with process, because my goal is to try to get you to be better at doing what you do, not to make your designs more like my designs.
Mm-hmm.
Although, if you follow the process, there will probably be some similarities, because this is generally the process that I use. But hopefully that makes sense. Like, there's a lot more clearer like we say a lot of like, well, the important thing is you need to define your goals, right? You need clearer design goals, and it's definitely one of those things that's way easier to say than it is to do. So hopefully this has made sense of like, here's kind of the process of generating those in a practical sense too, because it's not just this like abstraction of like, here's examples of good design goals, now go. It's because you're not going to start with fully formed good design goals. It's going to take some time to get there. You'll get there faster and faster as you improve, but you'll never be able to just start with perfect design goals. Like, that never happens. But you can, using good process, just think about your design in a way that makes your design better. You just have to be very rigid because it's a bit of a trap, right? It's not as easy as, well, if you're spending time on your design is improving. You need to know if that's happening, and in order to do that, you need good vision and good goals, because that's the criteria for whether or not your design is actually improving in an objective sense, the sense of what you're defining for your own design. So I know that we're going to come out of this with no clearer of an idea of what the actual encounter mechanics look like. That's fine. The question I have is, do you think you have a clearer idea of what like the next set of steps would look like do you have a pretty clear idea of what those next steps would look like, and also feel confident that if you followed them, you would definitely be improving your design?
Yeah, I think I do have a clear idea of what the next steps are. It's kind of, further, I guess, flesh out the tension and really hone in on what I want this fight to be, and then start iterating on those mechanics and see if they meet those design goals, and make sure that each element kind of is justified through some of the, at least one or a few of like the goals and tensions that we have set out.
Yeah. I mean, basically, I would also just clarify that like I laid out a couple different options for like what a next set of steps would look like, and also remember, I think you have it right. Those are basically the two things that you're going to be focusing on. Just remember that it's not necessarily in that order. It's not necessarily like a linear thing. Like, you do all of A and then all of B. You're going to do a little bit of A and then shift over to B and then do some of B and go, oh no, actually I'm going to tweak. And you might even, like, this has happened to me a bunch of times, where you find out that the initial narrative thing that you had planned just starts getting changed completely, because you're like, now that I'm driving this core tension, this is way more interesting, and if I just tweak the narrative to fit that, like, all of it can change, right? All of it is still up in the air until you actually run it, basically. The important thing is that you have everything, like all of the components fit together. So when we talk about a cohesive design, like an internally consistent design, that's what that means, is they all drive the same set of goals. Yeah. This is going to be tough. Because when you first start working with a process this rigid, it's really hard, because it's like, it's a tough, you have to get yourself in the habit of sort of identifying and making explicit the tacit questions and the problems that you're running into. But once you do, it, like, design becomes wonderful. It actually opens the world up to you so much, because there's no more like, you'll never again make a creature that just like, well, it has 18 AC because I want it. It seems about right.
Yeah.
It's gonna be more like, well, I want to make sure that their in the moment decisions are like somewhat efficient, but I can't make them so efficient that there's no reason that they would ever try to anticipate things, because if they're not trying to anticipate things, I lose all my tension. So instead, I'm gonna give this thing. So I need this thing to have 1819 AC. Why? Because yes, I want them to have efficiency, but I want them to have, when they have disadvantage on the invisible thing, I want them to almost never hit, because otherwise, immediate efficiency isn't. There's no tension between those things, because one just becomes clearly better. That's like now the specific AC even has like a really clear purpose. It's doing something. And yeah, you'll find that your design's just it's really hard for a while, but then you'll start to realize like, oh, my designs are like way better than they were like a month ago. It's like if you start learning music theory and you've been playing an instrument, and you just learn what scales are, and you start doing those, you go, oh, I'm a lot better now.
Yeah. Gotcha.
Yeah. But that's all the ranting I've got for today. I talked a lot. Oops. I do that.
That's
that.
fine. That's fine.
A good habit. Do you have any questions or comments? You can.
I guess none off the top of my head, because I guess it was pretty clear in terms of, what I was going for, how to improve my process. And honestly, just looking back, now that we've defined some of these goals, just looking back at what I have, some of these things are very arbitrary.
Yeah, and it's actually really hard to go from a place of building arbitrary goals, because you're like, I know I should have goals, but I don't know how to generate goals. So here's a goal, I guess. And that's actually perfectly valid as a starting point. I mean, when I did my video on the design of the Volomancer, I literally was just like, the starting point is irrelevant. My starting point for designing this class was, I hate wild magic. There's like, that's not that's not anything. That's just a feeling that I had. It doesn't.
Yeah.
But you can take that and go, what would I prefer to see? And that's still just a feeling. But then from that, you can start to generate the vision that's very clear and concrete. And then I ended up at a place that's much more like, here's what I'm trying to accomplish with this. And it's more or less what I always thought wild magic should be trying to accomplish, but doesn't. So that's fine, because I'll just make it accomplish these things. And because I can make an argument that wild magic doesn't accomplish those, they can both sit side by side in the same game, because they accomplish different things. Yeah, and it's great. And it's you can start, like, starting in an arbitrary position is basically inevitable, but there's a refinement process to get to the point where they're not anymore. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Anything else?
No, I think I have plenty of information to work off of, just refining this fight, and I guess a few others as well.
You'll probably also find, like with most things that are fairly complex and frankly kind of abstract, when you start applying it, you're going to start to see, like, it feels like it all sounds right. And then when you go to apply it, it's going to be like, I don't remember what this was, and I don't know how to do this. Like, that's going to happen pretty much inevitably. It's always a goal to alleviate that as much as possible. But of course, there's still GDA, right? So you can always ask questions.
Yep. Gotcha.
Okay, that's it for our event stream tonight. This has been our one-on-one design lesson thing. Also, it's more or less, it is an illustration of what anybody can expect from one-on-ones with me. This is pretty much how it goes. We just deal with the problem that you have and try to talk through it. I'm always big on process, because my big thing is always, we don't know what the conclusion is. We don't know if the conclusion is good yet, because I love to talk about objective quality in game design, but I also want to make the distinction between objective quality and absolute quality. Like, nothing can be good in an absolute sense. That's not a thing. But something can be, like, well designed from an objective standpoint, in the sense that it can be internally consistent and objectively achieve or fail to achieve your design goals. So it's less about the product being able to be assessed in objective quality. you can do that, but it's a different thing. And more about the process being assessed, because you don't have a product yet, right? You just have some ideas and some fairly arbitrary things that you've kind of written out that seem like they might work, but it's not really like a product that you would go, yes, stamp of approval, this is done. So that means that you can't trust. That means that you don't really have the tools to assess the product. You don't have tools to assess the end result, but you can assess the process that achieves the end result. So if you have a really good process and you can trust that process, and it's sort of built in as part of your regular habits when you're designing, then you can start to say, like, yes, the products are going to be good because the process that generates them is good. Just like how any problem solving works, right? If you don't understand how logic works, then your conclusions might not be good. You need to understand a logical process, like a syllogism. This is how we determine, right? Scientifically, that's how it works. This is how hypotheses work. If your argument is terrible, if the structure of your argument actually doesn't work in the sense that your premise doesn't, or your conclusion doesn't follow from your premises, it doesn't. All the testing in the world doesn't help, right? It doesn't. All the additional knowledge is meaningless because the structure of the argument doesn't work, and we don't know what the conclusion is. We have to trust logical structure, which we can trust. It's the same thing. Yeah, it's the same thing. That was my outro. That was my conclusion. So yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, thanks for coming along and being the guinea pig, basically.
No problem.
It was
also helpful for me to,
Yeah. I mean, hope so.
Yeah. Kind of work along head for a while, but yeah.
Is there anything you'd like to say to our 4 viewers, who are all people you could talk to at any point in GDA?
No, I mean, apart from have a great evening, this was actually really helpful because I've been stuck on just, I guess, arbitrarily throwing stuff into them and figuring out why it works later.
Yeah.
And reversing that process is
okay. Yeah, that's a valid component of a design process. It's just not the whole design process. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I'm glad to hear it. Okay, everybody. I think I'm not doing an event next week. I'm not gonna say if we are, because I don't want to commit to anything, because I'm not doing the event. I don't want to say if anybody else is doing an event, because I don't want to commit somebody else to something when I don't know. But keep an eye out for if that's happening, but it's not going to be one of mine. I'll resume the week after that, I think. But thanks everybody, as always, to checking out. Anybody who's watching this that's not already a part of GDA, go be part of GDA. It's better. Okay. Yeah, that's it. I'll see you guys in a couple of weeks, or on GDA. Bye. Bye-bye.